They mocked her grandfather's dusty medals like they were toys from a forgotten past, laughing loud enough for the whole diner to hear. But when 20 Navy SEALs walked through those doors and saluted the old man without a word, the room fell so silent you could hear hearts breaking. What started as a cruel joke turned into a moment that changed an entire town, and no one who witnessed it ever forgot the lesson. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was just after 8 a.m. when the regulars began trickling into the Bluebell Diner, a humble roadside joint nestled off Highway 47 in rural Vermont. The scent of brewed coffee and bacon fat always filled the air like an early morning promise, and the booths, worn in all the right places, felt like the kind of place you'd tell secrets and pass stories from one generation to the next. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody else's business, and newcomers stuck out like cats in a dog park. On this particular morning, however, the peace of this sleepy ritual was disturbed by the uncomfortable sound of teenage laughter, sharp, mean, and out of place. Seated in the corner booth, as he always was every Friday, sat Walter Hargrove, a man whose back was curved like a comma, but whose presence still carried the quiet weight of stories untold. He wore his usual faded navy blue jacket, but pinned across his chest were the medals, carefully arranged, proudly polished, medals he'd earned decades ago during his service as a Navy corpsman in the Gulf War, and later missions few people in town knew much about. He never talked about them. He just wore them every Veterans Day, Memorial Day, and Fridays when he visited his granddaughter after school. That morning, he wore them for no national reason, just because he wanted to, and that was enough. But to the group of out-of-towners, college-aged kids on some weekend road trip from Boston, they were little more than costume jewelry. They were seated at the long center table, legs stretched out, talking too loud, laughing too hard, like they owned the place. One of them, a lanky kid in a flannel shirt and backward cap, pointed at Walter, chuckled, and mimicked a salute with a smug grin. Another leaned in and whispered something that sent the rest of them into another round of laughter. Walter heard them. Everyone did. But he said nothing. He didn't even flinch. He simply stirred his coffee, folded the local paper beside his plate, and looked out the window like he hadn't heard a thing. But that stillness wasn't ignorance. It was restraint, learned from years of watching chaos with a steady hand and a still heart. At the counter, a young woman in her early 20s clenched her fists behind the cash register. Her name was Lila Hargrove, and she was Walter's granddaughter. A waitress by job title but fiercely loyal by blood, Lila had grown up on her grandfather's bedtime stories. The kind that weren't about monsters or princesses, but about real people who bled, lost, endured, and saved others at unthinkable costs. Her earliest memory was sitting in his lap, as he quietly cleaned his medals with an old toothbrush, telling her why he wore each one and what they meant. Not for glory, but for remembrance. He had always told her that some battles never leave the battlefield, they just go quiet, and that the real honor wasn't in being loud about it, but in carrying it with dignity. That morning, Lila saw that dignity under fire. Her grip on the countertop tightened as the boys continued their mockery, even louder now. One of them began filming on his phone, zooming in on the medals. Lila's heart pounded like a drum in her chest. The entire diner had turned tense, but no one said a word. Not out of agreement, but out of that paralyzing hesitation that grips ordinary people when injustice wears a cloak of humor. She wanted to scream, to throw them out, to grab the phone and hurl it against the wall. But her grandfather's calm presence restrained her, like an invisible hand on her shoulder. She knew he didn't want a scene. He'd endured worse. He always said, "You don't fight ignorance with fists, you fight it with truth and time." Still, she felt powerless. That was until the bell above the diner door jingled. It was subtle at first, just the chime, but then it was followed by boots, not one or two pairs, but several. Heavy, synchronized, deliberate, the kind of steps that made the floor vibrate, the air shift. Everyone turned to look, and when they saw them, 20 men in matching black shirts and ball caps with the unmistakable trident insignia of the Navy SEALs. Every voice in the room went silent. The laughter died like it had been cut off at the throat. The boys from Boston lowered their phones and looked around, confused, until the SEALs, without speaking a word, walked single file to Walter's table. Each man stood at attention in front of him, then saluted. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered with silver streaks in his beard, stepped forward, extended a hand, and said something no one could hear. But it was enough. Walter stood, slowly but proudly, and shook the man's hand. Every person in that diner felt the shift. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was something more. But how did they know? Why were they here? What did they mean to Walter Hargrove? The answers weren't in the medals, but in the man who wore them. And in the days that followed, the truth would change everything people thought they knew about the quiet old man in the corner booth. Walter Hargrove was the kind of man most people overlooked, not because he was forgettable, but because he carried himself with a kind of quiet that didn't demand attention. His presence was soft, almost deliberate, like an old tree standing at the edge of a field, weathered, steady, and deeply rooted in something that ran far deeper than the surface. He had lived in Fairbanks Hollow for over 40 years, a town so small the gas station doubled as the grocery store, and people still waved at each other from their front porches. Walter had seen the seasons change more times than most folks in town had seen presidents, and with each passing year, his shoulders stooped just a little lower, his walk slowed by the ghosts he never spoke of. But even in his worn boots and second-hand flannel jackets, there was something unmistakably dignified about him. He moved like a man who had learned to measure his steps, to carry pain without complaint, and to look strangers in the eye without flinching. Most people in Fairbanks Hollow knew him only as Lila's grandfather, the older man who sat in the same booth every Friday morning at the Bluebell Diner with his black coffee, rye toast, and a folded copy of the town paper. He was a fixture, part of the town's living furniture, but few really knew who he had been. Fewer still understood what those medals on his jacket represented. There was the Navy Cross, tucked neatly beside the Purple Heart, and the lesser-known Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. And then there were two ribbons so old their colors had started to fade, each marking a mission he had never discussed. Lila once asked him why he wore them, even when he knew some people would never understand or appreciate them, and he told her, simply, "Because I made a promise." That was Walter. Every word weighed before spoken, every action tied to a memory, every silence filled with meaning. His life had never been about show. He didn't attend the town parades or veterans' breakfasts. He never stood on stages or accepted plaques. When people thanked him for his service, he always responded with a small nod, not because he didn't appreciate it, but because he never believed serving his country was something to be congratulated for. It was something to be honored by how you lived afterward. And he lived simply. He tended his small backyard garden, fed the birds with crusts of old bread, fixed up broken radios in his garage, and most importantly, took care of Lila since her mother, his only daughter, passed away from cancer 8 years prior. He had raised Lila with the kind of steady love most kids only read about in books. He taught her how to fish, how to drive a stick shift, how to tie a proper knot and change a tire, and, more importantly, how to live with integrity even when no one was watching. Lila often said her grandfather was made of granite and velvet, strong enough to withstand anything, yet soft enough to catch tears without judgment. When her mother was dying, Walter had sat at her bedside every single day for 6 months, without fail, never leaving her alone, never breaking down in front of her. Only after the funeral, when everyone else had gone home and the house was silent, did Lila find him sitting on the back porch with his head in his hands. She never forgot that image. It taught her that real strength wasn't loud or unshakable. It was human, and it bent sometimes under the weight of love and loss. Walter had carried so many losses in his life. His wife Margaret, gone too soon in a car accident. His best friend Marcus, lost during a mission he refused to speak about. And his brothers-in-arms, whose names he carried silently like prayer beads he never let go of. Yet he never let bitterness take root. His smile, though rare, always reached his eyes. His laugh, though quiet, was genuine when it came. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had routines too. On Mondays, he went to the library to check out 2 books, always one history and one mystery. On Wednesdays, he cleaned the headstones at the old veterans cemetery, even the ones that had no visitors left. On Fridays, he visited the Bluebell Diner, not just for the coffee or the company, but because that was the one day Lila worked the morning shift, and he said seeing her happy made his week. Walter Hargrove was not a man who chased anything. Not recognition, not revenge, not even redemption. He simply lived by a code forged in battles both on and off the battlefield. A code that told him every life mattered, every moment counted, and every uniform, worn or buried, deserved respect. Yet for all his strength and history, he never asked for admiration. He never needed an audience. But even a man like Walter, who had stitched his life together with quiet dignity, was not immune to being misunderstood, underestimated, or mocked. And when that happened, especially in front of the one person who looked up to him most, something deeper stirred beneath the surface. He wouldn't react with rage or retaliation. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans, because sometimes even the most silent heroes are given a moment, just one, to be truly seen. And for Walter Hargrove, that moment was just beginning to unfold in ways no one in that diner or town could have imagined. Fairbanks Hollow sat like a forgotten comma between the taller, louder towns of Burlington and Montpelier, the kind of place people only noticed when they needed to stretch their legs on a long drive or when the foliage lit the hills in October and tourists snapped quick photos before moving on. It wasn't a place known for excitement or change. It was a town that held tight to tradition, where the calendar was still pinned to local festivals and farmers markets, and the biggest news of the week might be a new pie recipe at the diner or a missing barn cat returning home. Yet, within that sleepy stillness was a rhythm that the townspeople cherished, a safety in knowing who you were, who your neighbors were, and how to be decent in a world that often forgot what that meant. The Bluebell Diner sat on the corner of Main and Willow Street, right across from the post office, and just a stone's throw from the church where bells still rang every Sunday morning. It had been there for nearly 70 years, its pale blue siding weathered by sun and snow, its windows often fogged from the heat of the grill or the cold Vermont winters. The inside was modest, not flashy like the chain restaurants off the interstate. A long counter stretched along the left side, lined with stools whose vinyl seats had been patched more times than anyone could count. Booths with Formica tabletops and napkin dispensers sat under large windows that let in morning light. The walls were covered in photographs, black and white portraits of couples on their first dates, veterans in uniform, and community events from decades gone by. There were no televisions, just an old jukebox in the corner that still worked if you knew which quarters to wiggle. The diner was more than a place to eat. It was the social heart of the town. It was where farmers discussed the weather like it was a living thing with moods and grudges. Where retired teachers shared crossword puzzles over oatmeal and toast. Where teenagers lingered after school with milkshakes and gossip, and where, every Friday morning, Walter Hargrove sat in the booth by the window with a paper, a black coffee, and a presence that everyone quietly respected. Lila worked the morning shift on most days, balancing her time between refilling cups, taking orders, and exchanging small talk that often hinted at the deeper stories of people's lives. She loved the diner, not for its menu or the pay, but because it felt like home. It was the one place where she could see her grandfather interact with the world, nodding quietly to old friends, or silently tipping his head to young ones who didn't fully know what he represented, but sensed that he was someone worth respecting. The town itself moved slowly. Trucks kicked up dust on the gravel shoulders. Kids rode bikes down streets with names like Maple and Elm. The corner store still used handwritten signs to advertise sales on peanut butter and ice melt. There was a single traffic light, and even that was more decorative than necessary. In winter, snow draped everything like a quiet blanket, muffling the already gentle soundscape of daily life. In spring, the air smelled of thawing earth and distant rain. By summer, the town bloomed with wildflowers and porch swings, and in autumn, the hills ignited with color, drawing in the brief attention of visitors before fading back into calm. But under its postcard appearance, Fairbanks Hollow, like any place, held its share of wounds and prejudices. It was a town that honored its veterans with parades and flag-raising ceremonies, but didn't always remember to ask them how they were really doing. A town that could offer kindness in passing, but sometimes failed to stand up when kindness was needed most. Walter's story was known in pieces, fragments passed around like family recipes, each person adding or forgetting a detail. Some saw him as a hero. Others saw him as just another old man in a town full of them. And when outsiders arrived, like the college boys in the diner that morning, they often misread the quiet as weakness, the calm as irrelevance. The diner, though familiar, could shift tone like a violin string pulled too tight. When those boys started laughing, the walls seemed to close in. The usual hum of conversation dropped to a hush, replaced by the brittle sound of forced chuckles and uncomfortable shuffling. Even the sizzle from the grill seemed to lower in deference to the rising tension. No one moved to intervene, not yet. Not because they agreed, but because they didn't quite know how. That was the flaw in small towns. Everyone knew how to show up with casseroles after tragedy, but too few knew how to speak up in the moment it mattered most. And so the mocking went on, threading itself into the seams of that morning like an ugly tear in a favorite quilt. Yet it was also a town that, when given the chance, could still surprise you. There was still a flicker of something good buried beneath the layers of routine and reservation. There was still a heartbeat of pride that could rise when stirred. The Bluebell Diner, in all its familiarity, was about to become the stage for that transformation. Because in the stillness of that space, in the quiet rage building behind Lila's eyes, and the unspoken sorrow in Walter's silence, the seeds of something powerful had been planted. The kind of moment that would echo down the streets of Fairbanks Hollow long after the plates had been cleared, and the bell above the diner door had stopped ringing. The setting was simple, the people were real, and the lesson, though not yet fully revealed, would leave its mark on everyone present. The boys who entered the diner that morning weren't inherently evil, but they carried with them the careless arrogance of youth, the kind that often masquerades as confidence but is really just ignorance polished by peer validation. They were students from a university 2 hours east, spending their weekend on a spontaneous road trip, chasing foliage and freedom, fueled by caffeine and the untouchable feeling that nothing could touch them. They had stopped in Fairbanks Hollow because they thought it would be amusing, ironic even, a town so small and frozen in time that it might as well have been a movie set. They were not malicious planners or seasoned bullies. They were opportunists, born of a culture where clout could be harvested from someone else's dignity with the swipe of a phone camera and a few clever hashtags. At their center was the ringleader, Derek Blanton. Tall, lean, and quick-tongued, Derek had a natural talent for commanding attention. Not because he was particularly insightful or wise, but because he understood rhythm, timing, and the infectious energy of mockery. He wasn't the kind of man who insulted people directly. He wrapped his barbs in sarcasm and delivered them with a smirk that made others laugh before they questioned the cruelty behind it. Derek saw the world as a stage for his commentary, and everyone else was a prop or a punchline. When he walked into the Bluebell Diner with his group of 5, he scanned the room the way a hawk might survey a field, not for beauty, but for weakness. That's when he noticed Walter. Walter's metals caught the light just right as he sipped his coffee, and to Derek, they looked almost theatrical. There was no reverence in his gaze, only opportunity. To him, the image was funny. This ancient man, hunched and silent, decked out in metal like he was preparing for a parade in his own mind. Derek nudged his friend Kyle and whispered something behind his hand, barely containing a snicker. The others leaned in, curious, eager to ride the wave of whatever joke was about to be launched. It was subtle at first, just snide glances and mumbled jabs. But like gasoline near flame, all it took was a little spark for things to get loud. Derek started narrating a fake war story under his breath, in a gravelly voice, mimicking the sound of gunfire and explosions with exaggerated effects. Kyle followed suit, saluting dramatically and pretending to limp like an injured soldier. Another boy, Wes, pulled out his phone and zoomed in on Walter's jacket, angling it discreetly as he whispered that he was about to post it with the caption, "Medal of Delusion." The laughter that followed was sharp, bright, and aimed like a blade. It sliced through the soft hum of the diner, bending the air with its disrespect. They didn't notice, or perhaps didn't care, that Lila was standing behind the counter, watching it all unfold, her knuckles whitening around the handle of the coffee pot she had just refilled. To the rest of the diner, the boys' laughter didn't come across as funny. It sounded like a fire alarm in a church. The regulars lowered their eyes, their utensils hovering midair, their expressions frozen between discomfort and silent disapproval. But no one said anything. Derek thrived in that silence. He mistook it for agreement, for the validation that his humor was harmless, or even appreciated. But the truth was, it was the silence of stunned hesitation, of old wounds being reopened in public. Many of the older men in the diner were veterans themselves. Some had served in Korea, others in Vietnam. They knew what it meant to see a friend die with his name still unread back home. They knew what it meant to wear a medal that felt heavier than the medal suggested. But the boys didn't know any of that. They hadn't been taught to. Their education had come from screens and memes, from echo chambers where the past was something to parody and honor was a punchline. They didn't know that Walter had spent nights dragging wounded men through burning wreckage, or that he'd performed triage under sniper fire. They didn't know that the medals they were mocking had been pinned onto his chest by hands that no longer lived, during moments when even the air had tasted like blood and gunpowder. They didn't know, but they should have, because the moment they chose to laugh at those medals, they crossed a line not just of decency, but of humanity. The conflict wasn't just between old and young, tradition and trend. It was between two worldviews, one rooted in earned sacrifice, the other in borrowed cynicism. Walter didn't look at them. He didn't respond. That was part of what made the scene so uncomfortable. His silence wasn't weakness. It was a depth of restraint most people never needed to cultivate. He'd lived long enough to know that not all battles were worth fighting. But Lila, she was young, and the heat in her chest burned hotter with every snide laugh. She had grown up hearing about men who never came home. She had seen her grandfather cry only once, on the anniversary of a mission he never explained, when he whispered a name and placed a single flower on an unmarked grave. She knew what those medals meant. She knew they weren't decoration. They were scars forged into metal, carried with quiet reverence by a man who had never asked to be admired. And now, she stood frozen behind the counter, torn between the instinct to defend and the wish to honor her grandfather's wishes. The boys weren't just laughing at him. They were laughing at everything he stood for. And in that moment, something shifted, not just in her, but in the energy of the room. Because conflict doesn't always start with a slap or a scream. Sometimes it begins with a smirk, a phone, and a laugh that echoes just long enough to awaken the truth. It wasn't the first time Walter Hargrove had been the subject of mocking eyes or careless comments. In fact, there was an unspoken ritual that had unfolded over the past few years, especially as newer generations began drifting through Fairbanks Hollow with little context and even less curiosity. Tourists, out-of-towners, or the occasional drifter would pass through, spot the quiet old man in the corner booth wearing his medals, and snicker as if he were playing dress-up. They didn't see a veteran. They saw a relic, a prop from another era. Walter never flinched. He would remain still, breathing in that quiet way of his, eyes tracing the edge of his coffee cup, or the blur of a bird beyond the window. To him, these moments weren't worth disturbing the peace for, but to Lila, they built up like tiny cracks on glass, each one invisible at first, but eventually threatening to shatter something sacred. She had asked him once, in frustration, why he kept wearing the medals when he knew what people might think. He simply told her, because remembering is louder than forgetting. It was a strange answer, but one that stayed with her. Walter believed that every generation bore the responsibility of memory, that history wasn't just written in books, but in people, in daily rituals, in moments of silent resilience. So he came to the diner every Friday morning, as he had for the past 8 years, dressed modestly, but always with those medals pinned just above his heart. And each Friday, he ordered the same meal, folded the same paper, sat in the same booth, and watched the world move around him. There was a pattern to these visits, one that even the regulars came to accept like clockwork. The older patrons would nod to him respectfully. A few would offer a quiet, "Morning, Walt." The younger locals, those who had grown up seeing him in that booth, simply understood that he was part of the diner, as much as the counter or the jukebox. Newcomers, however, were different. Some approached with awkward questions about the medals, curious but respectful. Walter would answer with brevity, never offering more than necessary. Others kept their distance, sensing perhaps that there was more to him than they understood. But then there were those who did neither. They mocked, they whispered, they giggled like the boys this morning had. They repeated a pattern that had become all too familiar. See the old man, laugh at the pageantry, walk out with an Instagram story they would forget by sunset. But there had always been an understanding between Walter and Lila. She had promised never to cause a scene. He had asked her to let it go each time, to let ignorance pass like a breeze through an open window. "The wind doesn't stop for fools," he once said. Yet, with each repetition of the same hurtful script, it became harder for Lila to breathe through it. Harder to ignore the sting in her chest when someone disrespected the man who had given up so much to ensure they even had the right to speak freely. Harder to bite her tongue when the weight of so many silences pressed down on her shoulders. And lately the ritual had begun to wear even on Walter. Though he never said anything, Lila noticed the small changes, the longer pauses before he entered the diner, the way his hands trembled slightly when pinning the medals, the distant look in his eyes when another phone was raised toward him like a weapon. He wasn't broken, but he was tired. Tired in a way that only years of being misunderstood could carve into a man. He never asked for respect, but the steady erosion of it around him, especially when aimed at the very symbols of his fallen brothers, was beginning to take a toll. That morning's incident followed the same pattern, but it cracked the rhythm in a new way. The boys were bolder, their laughter was louder, their mockery more performative. And the audience, though filled with locals, remained silent. That silence cut deepest, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't act. And Walter, sitting in the booth, with his hands wrapped around his mug, was the calm eye of that growing storm. His ritual was being defiled not just by the mockery, but by the acceptance of it, by the resignation in people's eyes, by the quiet complicity of those who looked away. Lila had reached her breaking point. As the ringleader filmed his video and the others laughed, she stood rooted behind the counter, jaw tight, her breath shallow. She knew this scene too well, and yet it had never felt this personal, this sharp. This wasn't just a ritual being repeated, it was a ritual being challenged. And something in her heart told her that the old ways of responding would no longer suffice. Something had to change. The pattern had to break, because while Walter might have carried his burdens with grace, she could no longer carry the weight of silence. But neither of them knew that help was already on its way, that elsewhere in the state, men who owed their lives to Walter Hargrove were mobilizing, that someone who had once served beside him, who had stayed in quiet contact through handwritten letters and unlisted phone numbers, had been notified by a whisper in the wind, a shared photo, a forwarded message, a caption too cruel to ignore. and that these men, these brothers not by blood but by battle, were preparing to remind the world, and that diner, who Walter Hargrove really was. The ritual had played out long enough. The pattern was about to be shattered, and the silence? It was about to be broken in the most unforgettable way. The morning after the diner incident, Elara awoke to find her phone flooded with notifications, messages, calls, friend requests from people she didn't know, and news alerts featuring a photo of her and her grandfather, taken during that awkward moment when she stood at his side, facing the cruel laughter. She blinked at the brightness of the screen, her breath catching in her throat when she realized that someone had posted a short video of the taunting scene, followed by the moment Sergeant Blake stood up, straightened his back, and met the mockery with unwavering dignity. The clip had gone viral overnight. Tens of thousands of comments poured in, most expressing support, outrage at the bullies, and deep admiration for the old veteran. But as with anything that spread online like wildfire, there were also the skeptics, the cynics, and the relentless trolls who questioned everything: his service record, his medals, his integrity. Elara's stomach turned reading some of those comments. Even though the majority were on their side, the idea that her grandfather's honor was now being dissected by anonymous strangers across the internet filled her with a strange mixture of shame and fury. She hurried downstairs, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the phone, and found Blake already sitting at the kitchen table, newspaper in hand, a quiet cup of black coffee beside him. His eyes flicked up briefly, amused, as if he knew what had happened without needing her to say a word. "I suppose we're famous now," he murmured, folding the paper neatly and setting it aside. Elara's jaw tensed. She wanted to shield him from the ugliness of it all, from the scrutiny that had no right to poke around his past. She sat down across from him and asked softly, "Are you okay with all this?" Blake shrugged, the gesture weary but calm. "I've been called worse, sweetheart. Besides, I've spent my life doing what I knew was right. Whether the world chooses to believe it or not is on them." That simple, grounded response should have been enough. But Elara couldn't shake the restless energy thrumming beneath her skin. She needed to do more. She needed to defend him, not with words, but with action. That very afternoon, she made her way to the local Veterans Hall. It was an aging brick building, tucked beside the town library, often overlooked by those who passed it daily. But inside, its walls held decades of memories, portraits of servicemen and women, shadow boxes of old flags, and shelves filled with handwritten journals, medals, and preserved uniforms. Elara approached the front desk, where a man in his 60s with a graying beard and a ball cap that read USS Hornet looked up from his paperwork. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked. She straightened her shoulders, trying to channel some of her grandfather's poise. "I'm here to look into my grandfather's service record. His name is Blake Alden." The man raised an eyebrow. "Blake Alden? The Blake Alden?" She nodded, surprised. "You know him?" He leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "Served with him, years ago. Quiet guy, but one hell of a soldier. He was part of Operation Starfall. Not many people even know about it." Elara's eyes widened. What was Operation Starfall? The man glanced around and then motioned for her to follow him into a back room. Inside, surrounded by filing cabinets and faded flags, he pulled out a folder from a locked drawer and laid it on the table. "A lot of it's still classified, but what I can tell you is this. Your grandfather was part of a covert rescue mission in 1987. Deep enemy territory. They extracted hostages under fire, got out without losing a man, took guts and precision. He didn't just earn those medals, he bled for them." Elara felt a lump rising in her throat. All her life, her grandfather had been humble, almost secretive about his service. He never boasted, never even shared details unless she pried, and even then, it was always the sanitized version. But here was confirmation from a man who had stood beside him in battle. She felt vindicated, and more than that, deeply moved. Before she left, the man handed her a photocopy of one of the commendation letters from that mission. "If anyone ever questions him again, show them this," he said. "And tell him Marcus says hello." Ilara returned home that evening with renewed resolve. She printed out the commendation, framed it, and set it beside the medals on the mantel. Her grandfather didn't say much when he saw it, but the subtle shift in his expression, a flicker of surprise, then a soft smile, told her everything. That night, she posted a long message on social media. It wasn't angry or defensive. It was a tribute. She told the story of Operation Starfall, of her grandfather's courage, of the legacy he had never tried to flaunt. She ended it with a simple line. "He didn't ask for recognition, but I will not let the world forget who he is." The post exploded, not just with likes and shares, but with heartfelt messages from veterans and families of soldiers, many of whom had similar stories of quiet bravery. People began tagging organizations, news outlets, and even military personnel. Something had shifted. The conversation was no longer about mocking or doubt. It was about honoring. What Ilara didn't yet know was that someone very important had taken notice, and they were about to step into her world in a way no one expected. The following week brought with it an unexpected stillness, the kind that only comes after emotional turbulence has left its imprint on the soul. Rosie sat alone at the counter of the diner, staring blankly at the laminated menu she knew by heart. She wasn't really hungry, but being in that space, amidst the smell of sizzling bacon and faint traces of spilled coffee, somehow anchored her. Since the incident with the medals and the laughter that followed, her emotions had felt stretched thin, like an old rubber band about to snap. Her grandfather, always early, hadn't arrived yet. Normally, he'd be seated at their favorite corner booth by now, tapping the side of his mug in rhythm with the ticking wall clock, his medals already polished and gleaming proudly on his chest. But this morning, there was only the echo of a soft hum from the kitchen and the occasional clatter of plates from the back. Rosie checked her phone, heart skipping at every vibration, hoping it was a message from him. But it wasn't. Just reminders and silent updates from apps she barely used. When the front door creaked open, her eyes shot up. For a second, she hoped it was Grandpa Ed, but it wasn't. It was the local mailman, nodding at her politely before settling at a nearby booth. She turned her gaze back to the counter, the anxiety gnawing at her insides like a slow burn. The memory of the previous Saturday refused to fade. That sharp laughter, the pointed fingers, the way her grandfather's shoulders seemed to shrink despite his age and discipline. And that waitress, the one with the gum and the side smirk, who thought she was being funny at someone else's expense. Rosie hadn't seen her since, and neither had her grandfather. Rumor had it, someone complained, and she was asked to take a week off. But Rosie knew the damage had already been done. Her grandfather, who'd faced enemy fire and the weight of battle in his youth, had returned to civilian life, only to be mocked in his twilight years for wearing medals that symbolized sacrifice. It was wrong on every level, and Rosie couldn't shake the guilt that clung to her for not standing up sooner, louder, stronger. Just then, the door opened again. This time, it was Grandpa Ed. He moved slower than usual, his steps deliberate, cautious, as if every inch of the floor might give way beneath him. His medals were still on, but they didn't shine like before. There was a dullness to them, or maybe it was in the way he wore them, a weight rather than a pride. He managed a faint smile when he saw Rosie, but she could see through it. It wasn't the smile of a proud veteran. It was the forced expression of a man trying not to let the world see how deeply he had been cut. Rosie stood to greet him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, whispering that she was glad he came. He nodded, patted her hand, and sat down slowly, wincing as he lowered himself into the booth. Their conversation that morning was minimal, just soft exchanges about the weather and her latest college projects. She didn't want to push him, not yet. She knew his pride was too intact to process things openly. But beneath every word, every sigh, there was an unspoken ache, his and hers, woven into a silent thread connecting them across the table. The regulars walked past them occasionally, a few nodding respectfully, some giving him a salute that felt more sincere than any medal ever pinned. Rosie appreciated those small gestures. They may not undo the past, but they helped stitch together something kinder. What she didn't expect, though, was the envelope. It came from the front counter. Laura, the owner, walked over and placed it beside Grandpa Ed's coffee cup. "This came in this morning," she said softly, almost reverently. Rosie looked up, puzzled. "No return address," Laura added, then walked away. Ed picked it up slowly, adjusting his glasses. The envelope was thick, its paper a soft ivory shade with a subtle embossing at the edge. He opened it carefully, as if it might tear from the tension in his fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, neat, and signed at the bottom. As his eyes scanned it, Rosie noticed his expression change. Confusion gave way to something else. His lips parted slightly, his brows furrowed in disbelief. Then, slowly, tears began to form. Rosie reached over instinctively, grabbing the paper and reading it aloud in a hushed tone. It was a letter of recognition from a group of retired Navy SEALs, men who had served in the same conflict zones Ed once did. The letter spoke of honor, of respect, and of the importance of reminding the younger generations about the sacrifices made. But that wasn't all. At the bottom, a sentence stood out. "We heard what happened. We don't take that lightly. We'll be visiting soon." No date, no time. Just that. A promise. A whisper of something greater in motion. Rosie blinked in disbelief. Was this real? Grandpa Ed looked as though he had seen a ghost, but in a good way. Something inside him reignited, like a forgotten spark catching wind once again. He folded the letter with the utmost care and tucked it into the breast pocket of his jacket, right behind his medals. That day, they stayed longer at the diner. There was a lightness to Ed's laugh that hadn't been there in days. He even made a joke about the eggs being rubbery again, which made Rosie grin. As they finished their meals, she noticed him sitting a little taller, his back straighter, the medals now seeming to glow again. Something had shifted, not just for him but for Rosie too. Because now she knew that she wasn't alone in her admiration for the man he was. Others knew. Others remembered. And somewhere, out there, people were moving. Quietly, respectfully, with purpose. A storm of honor was brewing, and soon it would walk through those diner doors. As the crisp morning gave way to a golden afternoon, the town of Elmridge settled into its usual lull. Trudy's footsteps echoed against the pavement as she walked back from the school library, arms full of materials for her speech. Her fingers were ink-smudged from hours of research, pages of handwritten notes tucked into the folder pressed against her chest. A quiet sense of determination settled over her, a drive fueled not by vengeance, but by the need to reclaim dignity for her grandfather and for herself. At the diner, Pete was already seated in their usual booth, a coffee steaming in front of him, his wrinkled hands folded neatly as if in silent prayer. He'd taken to arriving early, not out of impatience, but to give Trudy space to lead. He wanted her to feel ownership of this moment. When she arrived, he glanced up with a quiet smile, the kind that didn't show teeth but carried a lifetime of wisdom behind it. Trudy sat down, pulled out her notes, and for the next hour, they reviewed her speech, refining it line by line. He didn't speak much, but every now and then, he'd point to a phrase and offer a suggestion, usually something understated, always powerful. When she finished reading aloud the section describing his rescue mission from 30 years prior, his eyes didn't meet hers. He simply nodded and said, "That's enough." And that was how she knew it wasn't just a good speech. It was the right one. Elsewhere in Elmridge, the winds of change had begun to whisper in corners previously deaf to reason. Ms. Davidson, the literature teacher, had come across the incident in the cafeteria and had filed a quiet report to the administration. Though nothing immediate came of it, the ripple had begun. Meanwhile, Hayden and his friends, despite their bravado, were not immune to the undercurrent of tension that followed them. Rumors spread fast in a small town, and while most people avoided confrontation, they started giving them second looks, not of fear, but quiet judgment. Mrs. Conway, the diner's owner, also took notice. She'd been there the day of the incident, standing behind the counter as Trudy stormed out. It had bothered her ever since. She was the kind of woman who didn't speak unless she had something to say, but when she did, people listened. She approached Pete a few days later during one of his solitary coffee visits, offering a firm apology, not just on behalf of the diner, but for her silence. Pete accepted it with grace, but Trudy's resolve only grew stronger. What she wanted wasn't pity, it was awareness. Respect earned, not handed down as a favor. Preparations for the Veterans Day assembly ramped up. The school auditorium was modest, but decorated with streamers of red, white, and blue. A student committee managed the logistics, while teachers coordinated the sequence of events. Trudy was scheduled to speak just after the principal's opening remarks. She knew the slot was important, not just symbolically but strategically. It meant the audience would be fresh, the energy still high, and all eyes on her. She practiced her speech late into the night, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with each pass. Pete never pushed her, but he was always nearby, a silent presence in the living room chair or at the kitchen table, as if his very being lent her the courage she hadn't realized she'd needed. On the eve of the event, she asked him one last time, "Are you sure you want to be there?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable, then finally said, "Yes, but not for them. For you." What Trudy didn't know was that something unexpected was already in motion. A few days earlier, one of Pete's former Navy SEAL teammates, Marcus Hawk Harper, had caught wind of what had happened. A mutual friend, still in touch with Pete from their days stationed in the Gulf, had called Hawk after hearing the story secondhand from a cousin in Elm Ridge. Pete never mentioned it. He wasn't one for self-promotion or pity, but the story traveled faster than he could control. Hawk, now living in North Carolina, had quietly made a few calls. He didn't do it for drama or spectacle. He did it because, as he put it in a brief message to the group, "No man gets mocked for service under my watch. Not after what Pete did for us in '93. The result? A quiet, coordinated plan to show up in Elm Ridge, without warning, in uniform and with presence. Meanwhile, Trudy remained unaware. Her focus was singular: deliver the speech, honor her grandfather, and move on with dignity. She didn't care if Hayden applauded. She didn't care if the auditorium fell silent. She just wanted the truth to be heard. The truth about a man who had risked his life for a country that sometimes forgot the people who held it up. The morning of the event, she woke early, nerves pulsing through her stomach. She wore a navy blue dress and pinned her grandfather's smaller medal to the left side of her chest. Not the Purple Heart, that one was Pete's and would stay locked safely in his drawer, but the Silver Star replica he'd allowed her to borrow. Pete wore his best pressed shirt, an old jacket from his younger days that still held the faint scent of cedar and thyme. As they drove to the school, the streets of Elm Ridge looked unchanged. Trees lined the sidewalks, shop windows displayed early holiday decor, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the corner bakery. But for Trudy, everything felt different. This was more than a school event, it was a turning point. And somewhere beyond the winding roads and sleepy storefronts, 20 Navy SEALs were driving too, some from hours away, one from another state entirely. They weren't coming for applause. They weren't coming for conflict. They were coming because brotherhood never dies, and because sometimes silence isn't enough. Justine had barely stepped outside to breathe in the cold morning air when she saw it, an old, dusty black pickup truck pulling into the diner's small gravel parking lot. It wasn't out of place on its own. Old trucks and tired engines were common in this town, but what followed next made her breath catch. Another vehicle, then a third, and a fourth. Each one more imposing than the last. A row of dark SUVs and pickups, nondescript but deliberate, started lining up outside the diner like a convoy moving through enemy lines. She blinked, trying to make sense of it, her heart starting to race. Inside, her grandfather was quietly stirring his coffee, unaware of what was coming. He had no idea that something extraordinary was about to crash into the ordinary rhythm of their lives. The bell above the diner door jingled once, a sharp, clipped sound that echoed with authority. In walked a tall man, square-jawed, clean-shaven, dressed casually but with unmistakable precision in his bearing. He looked around, scanning the diner with the quiet intensity of someone trained to read a room in seconds. Behind him, another man entered. Then, another. Within moments, the entire diner was slowly filling with men, some younger, some older, but all with the same deliberate movements, the same steel in their posture. Their clothes were varied, flannel, plain tees, jackets, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. These were not locals coming in for a morning coffee. These men were military. And not just any branch. These were SEALs. It was the patches, subtle, discreet ones on the shoulders of some of their jackets, or the small tattoos near their wrists, and even the way a few nodded at each other silently, communicating more with a glance than others did with full sentences. By the time the last of them walked in, Justine counted 20 of them. 20 Navy SEALs, standing silently in the diner, as if they were waiting for something. She looked over at the counter where her grandfather sat, still unaware, his medals slightly visible from beneath his coat, the edges glinting in the morning light. And then the first man, the one who had led them in, stepped forward. He removed his baseball cap, revealing a close buzz cut, and placed it respectfully over his chest. He turned toward George and stood at attention. The diner went silent. Not a fork clinked. Not a coffee cup moved. For a moment, it was as though time had frozen. The other SEALs followed suit. One by one, they faced George, placed their caps or hands over their hearts, and stood in a line. Justine's breath caught. This wasn't some spontaneous visit. This was a formation. A tribute. George, startled by the shift in atmosphere, slowly turned around on his stool. He looked up, confused at first. Then his eyes began to widen as they scanned the 20 men standing before him in silent salute. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the edge of the counter, grounding himself in the sudden wave of emotion that surged through him. The lead SEAL finally spoke. His voice was deep, steady, and full of weight. He addressed George with a kind of reverence Justine hadn't heard before. He said they had come to honor him. That word had reached their network. Yes, their network. About what had happened at this very diner. About the mockery, the disrespect. Veterans like George, he said, should never have to hang their heads or be treated like relics. They were the foundation on which the next generations of soldiers, of SEALs, had been built. A few of the SEALs behind him nodded solemnly. One of them stepped forward and placed a folded flag on the counter beside George's coffee. Another handed him a plaque with a simple inscription, "For valor in the face of war and dignity in the face of ignorance." George tried to speak, but his voice cracked before the words came. His eyes welled up, and he turned to Justine, stunned. She stood, frozen by the coffee machine, her eyes already brimming with tears. She had fought so hard to keep him from being broken by the weight of the world's indifference. But this was healing in action. As the diner patrons watched in awed silence, the 20 SEALs stepped forward, one by one, to shake George's hand. Some clasped his shoulder, a few gave him brief nods of deep respect. And when it was done, the lead SEAL turned to Justine. He thanked her, not just for standing by her grandfather, but for reminding the world what integrity looked like. He said the way she defended George inspired more than just sympathy. It sparked unity among those who had served, who still served, and who remembered their own forgotten heroes. Then, as quickly and quietly as they had entered, the SEALs began to file out, leaving behind a silence now filled not with awkwardness, but reverence. George remained seated at the counter, one hand on the folded flag, the other resting lightly on the plaque. His eyes stared straight ahead, but it was clear he was no longer in this moment. He was remembering the brothers he had once fought beside, the fallen who had never come home, the years spent being invisible in the very country he had defended. Justine sat beside him, not saying a word, her presence the only thing anchoring him as he floated between memory and recognition. For the first time in years, George didn't feel forgotten. And for the first time in her life, Justine felt like her voice, however small, however tremulous, had made a difference. The diner, once a place of routine and ridicule, had become the unlikely ground where honor had made a quiet, unshakable stand. Molly stared at her phone, fingers trembling as she reread the message from Officer Camden for the 5th time. "Bring your grandfather to the diner at 2 p.m. sharp tomorrow. No questions." There had been no explanation, no elaboration, just that cryptic line. She tried calling back, but the call went to voicemail. Her gut twisted with uncertainty, but something in her heart told her this wasn't something to be afraid of. It was something she needed to trust. She glanced across the room at her grandfather, who sat in his armchair by the window, dozing lightly in the afternoon light, the same soft light that had poured into the diner the day they were mocked. Her chest tightened at the memory, those harsh laughs, the sharp jabs, the disrespect, and her grandfather's quiet dignity through it all. The weight of it still pressed down on her, even now, but she also remembered the way the waitress had straightened her posture when she noticed him, the way a few eyes had darted away in shame once they realized what those medals meant. That moment hadn't ended with closure. It had merely been the beginning. The following day, Molly dressed her grandfather in his cleanest shirt, brushed his hair, and pinned his medals to his jacket. He looked confused, but didn't resist. She told him they were going out for lunch, and when he asked why she was being so formal about it, she simply kissed his forehead and told him he'd understand soon. As they walked out into the warm summer sun, Molly couldn't shake the feeling that something was building beneath the surface, like a quiet hum in the air. The streets seemed too still, the world too calm, and her instincts buzzed with anticipation. When they pulled into the diner's lot, her stomach flipped. There were more cars than usual. A few unfamiliar ones, too, dark SUVs with government plates. Her grandfather noticed but said nothing. He simply adjusted his medals, sat a bit straighter, and followed her through the diner's double doors. The moment they stepped inside, the buzz of quiet conversation halted. Every eye turned toward them, but not with the sharpness of mockery this time. The air was thick with reverence, an almost sacred silence falling over the space. Standing in 2 neat lines by the back wall were 20 men in uniform. Not just any men. These were elite, muscular, upright, composed. Navy SEALs. Each man wore a Navy dress uniform, pristine and pressed. Each one had the same medal pinned to his chest. As Molly and her grandfather reached the center of the room, one of the SEALs stepped forward. His eyes were wet with restrained emotion. He saluted sharply, then lowered his hand and said in a voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear, "Mr. Thomas Riley, sir, we're here to thank you." Her grandfather's eyes widened. Molly could see his lips part slightly, as if to question what was happening, but the young man continued. He introduced himself as Lieutenant Samuel Voss, a second-generation SEAL whose father had served in Vietnam. "Your name is known to us. Your actions, your service, they've been studied in our training. Your mission in '68, the rescue op in Da Nang, you saved people who later became our instructors. You gave us a legacy." Thomas looked completely overwhelmed, his wrinkled hands trembling, eyes misting. Around them, the crowd began to stand. Even the same teenagers who had once laughed at him were now silent, their faces red with embarrassment. Lieutenant Voss stepped aside, and the other SEALs approached one by one, each shaking Thomas's hand, each offering words of thanks, respect, or a crisp salute. Some had brought old photos. One had a patch from the same unit Thomas had once been a part of. Another had a letter from his own father, thanking Thomas for saving his life during a mission gone wrong decades ago. The emotion in the room became a current. People started crying, waitresses, cooks, patrons. A man from the kitchen emerged to take a photo. And soon, phones were snapping pictures of the veteran being surrounded by heroes he never thought he'd meet. Molly stood to the side, her hand over her heart, feeling like it might burst with pride. The diner that had once been the stage for her humiliation had transformed into a hall of honor, and her grandfather, the reluctant star, was finally receiving the recognition he had never asked for but wholly deserved. Then came the final surprise. Lieutenant Voss gestured toward a small TV that had been wheeled in near the bar. A video began playing, a compilation of interviews from former Navy personnel, now retired, speaking about Thomas Riley's bravery, his calm under fire, and his selflessness. There were letters from senators, even a message from the Secretary of the Navy, all expressing their gratitude. The final shot was a certificate from the Department of Defense, naming July 12th as Thomas Riley Day in the state of New Hampshire. Molly turned to her grandfather, whose tears now rolled freely down his cheeks. He wasn't a man given to displays of emotion, but this overwhelmed him. He reached up to brush the tears away, but Lieutenant Voss placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Sir, you never needed to speak your story. Your actions told it for you." And we listened. The silence after that sentence was profound. And in that moment, everything Molly had felt, anger, sadness, frustration, helplessness, washed away, replaced by something that anchored her firmly in place. Justice. Dignity. A full circle reckoning. Her grandfather's medals were no longer ignored or laughed at. They were honored, seen, and remembered. This wasn't just redemption. It was restoration. By the time the storm settled outside and the diner's windows began to fog from the warmth within, Sarah noticed something remarkable happening. Word of the commotion earlier, the mockery, the confrontation, and the unexpected gathering had somehow rippled beyond the walls of Doris's diner. It began with a few curious locals trickling in. Then the camera crews arrived. Someone must have shared a clip online, and within hours, it had gone viral. But amidst the growing attention, Jack remained quietly seated in his booth, sipping black coffee and occasionally glancing at the medals still resting beside his plate. There was a storm outside, but in his corner of the diner there was calm. What unfolded next, however, would test the strength of that calm and force Jack to confront the very past he had spent decades trying to forget. As the reporters tried to coax interviews out of Jack, he declined with a quiet shake of the head. Sarah gently explained that her grandfather wasn't interested in fame or spectacle. But while Jack was no longer fighting battles on the front lines, the fight for dignity was still real, and now very public. The manager of the diner, Mr. Kellerman, returned from the back office, slightly flustered and speaking quickly. Apparently, their phone hadn't stopped ringing. Some callers were thanking them for standing up for veterans. Others were booking tables for the next day, just to sit where the Navy SEALs had stood. But there were also threats, nasty ones from people who had taken offense at how the teens had been treated, likely egged on by online echo chambers. Kellerman looked nervous. The diner wasn't used to being a national flashpoint. But Jack didn't blink. He simply asked if the teens were still there. They weren't. Their parents had arrived shortly after the SEALs left and pulled them out hastily. Sarah had watched them go, faces red with humiliation, but now she felt an unexpected tug of pity, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because it was clear they had never truly understood what they had ridiculed. That ignorance, she realized, was a failure of their upbringing, education, and community. And maybe, just maybe, that failure could still be corrected. Jack leaned towards Sarah and said something that surprised her. He asked if she would accompany him to speak to the high school principal the next day, not to report the students, but to request something different. "They need to learn what those medals actually mean," he said, his voice low but resolute. Sarah agreed. She was starting to see that the story unfolding wasn't just about a confrontation. It was becoming a movement, one Jack hadn't planned but now felt responsible for. That night, Jack stayed at Sarah's apartment. The couch was too short, but he never complained. As Sarah fixed him a light dinner, He brought out an old shoebox from his duffel bag, the one he rarely let anyone touch. Inside were faded photographs, a folded flag, and a yellowed journal. Sarah sat beside him in silence as he handed her a photo of a young man in uniform, standing beside two others. "That's Ethan and Lamont," he said. "We met in basic, only I made it back." Sarah didn't ask what had happened. She didn't have to. Jack's eyes, shimmering in the glow of the lamp, told her everything. The next morning they walked into the local high school. Principal Marin was waiting, having already heard the buzz. To his credit, he welcomed them in, listened patiently, and nodded as Jack made his request. An assembly where he could speak directly to the students, not as a hero, not as a victim, but as someone with a story worth hearing. Marin agreed. The auditorium was packed that Friday afternoon. Students filed in, expecting perhaps a lecture or a punishment. What they got instead was a masterclass in humility and humanity. Jack didn't speak loudly. He didn't dramatize or embellish. He simply told them what the medals on his chest meant, how one represented pulling a wounded comrade to safety under enemy fire. Another marked survival in a POW camp. The Bronze Star had a backstory so harrowing that several students turned pale, just hearing it. And then he paused, pulling from his pocket a different medal. It was small and unadorned. "This one," he said, "was given to me by a little girl in Fallujah. She made it from a broken bracelet and called it her lucky charm. She gave it to me after I brought her and her mother to safety during a firefight." He held it up. "It's worth more than any of these." Silence hung in the room like mist. After his talk, Jack turned to leave, but a hand shot up. It was one of the boys from the diner, the one who had led the laughter. His face was red, eyes downcast, voice shaking. He asked Jack a question that surprised everyone. "Would you teach us?" he said. "Like, help us understand more about this, about what you went through." Jack paused, then slowly nodded. "Only if you're willing to listen." Outside the school that day, Jack and Sarah sat on a bench beneath an old maple tree. For the first time in years, Jack looked less like a man carrying the weight of wars, and more like a teacher preparing for his next lesson. Sarah turned to him and said, "You didn't just stand up for yourself today. You stood up for what's right." Jack smiled, then looked out at the distant field where students were playing. "If even one of them walks out of here with a little more respect," he said, "then it was worth every step." And somewhere, deep in the core of who he was, Jack felt something long dormant stir back to life, a sense of purpose beyond medals and memories. Ella held her breath as the last of the officers exited the diner, their crisp uniforms disappearing one by one through the fogged-up glass doors, leaving behind an echo of unity that filled the room with reverence. The transformation of the atmosphere was undeniable. What had once been a place thick with smug amusement now felt like hallowed ground. But the most striking change was within her grandfather, whose shoulders no longer stooped with the burden of unspoken history. Instead, they stood tall beneath the sun-faded olive jacket, medals catching the light like quiet stars. In the aftermath of the visit, people didn't quite know how to act. Some patrons had already left in awkward silence, their eyes avoiding both Ella's and her grandfather's. Others lingered as if waiting for a cue on how to respond, clinging to coffee cups gone cold or plates only half finished. The waitress, who earlier had been polite but dismissive, approached the table. Her expression softened into one of genuine contrition. She poured Earl a fresh cup of coffee without a word and placed a blueberry muffin beside it, warmed and glistening with melted butter, her silent offering. Earl gave her a slow nod of thanks. Ella looked around and noticed a young boy sitting with his father across the diner. The boy, who looked about 8 or 9, held a napkin in his lap and clutched a small plastic figure of a soldier in one hand. He stared at Earl with wide eyes and a kind of innocent awe. Slowly, he slid off the booth and shuffled over, glancing back at his dad for reassurance. When he reached their table, he extended the little figure out with trembling hands. "Mister," he said softly, "you can have my soldier. He's a hero like you." Earl looked down at the tiny green plastic man, then up into the boy's earnest face. With the gentlest smile, he accepted the toy and placed it next to his medals. "Thank you, son. He'll keep the others company." The boy beamed and hurried back to his father, who mouthed the silent, "Thank you," from across the room. And just like that, the spell of discomfort broke. People began to clap. Not loud, but consistent. A slow, heartfelt rhythm that filled the space like a warm tide, lapping away the remnants of ignorance that had stained the air. Ella felt her throat tighten with emotion as her grandfather raised his hand in a small salute to the room. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything. They stayed at the diner longer than planned, mostly because person after person came up to thank Earl, to ask questions, to share stories of their own relatives who had served. One man in his 60s pulled out a worn photo of his father in a World War II uniform. Another woman recalled writing letters to her brother stationed overseas. These conversations wove a tapestry of connection and healing, a collective acknowledgement that their stories mattered. As they finally stepped out into the late afternoon sun, Ella noticed her grandfather's gait had changed. He walked with a steadiness she hadn't seen in years, not from physical strength, but from emotional release. The weight of invisibility had been lifted, at least for today. They drove in comfortable silence for a while until Earl spoke, his voice reflective. "You know, I never expected a day like this," he said. "For a long time I didn't think anyone cared. It's not medals that matter, it's being remembered." Ella reached across the seat and squeezed his hand. "Well, Grandpa, today they remembered. And I promise, I always will." Back at his home, the front porch light had started to flicker on with the fading sun. The flag in his yard waved gently in the breeze, catching the golden hour light just right. Earl walked up the steps and turned to face Ella, who stood by the truck, watching him. "You've got a good heart," he said, "and a strong voice. Use it. Don't let anyone silence it, not when it can do so much good." Ella nodded, tears she didn't try to hide welling in her eyes. The story that had begun in that diner wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning to ripple outward. A few days later, she posted a short video on social media, a simple clip of her grandfather placing the little green soldier next to his medals. She spoke over the video, sharing what had happened, what it meant to him, what it should mean to all of us. The post went viral. Veterans and their families from around the country began to comment, to thank Earl, to share their own images and memories. The local news picked it up, and soon larger outlets followed. Messages poured in from military members stationed abroad, from teachers using it as a lesson in history class, and from teenagers who admitted they never knew what those medals even meant, until now. The moment had grown into a movement, not for fame, not for pity, but for respect, for visibility, for legacy. One morning, not long after the video's reach had spread beyond anything they imagined, Ella received an official letter in the mail. It was addressed to Earl, but her name was listed as the return contact. The emblem of the Department of the Navy was embossed in gold on the envelope. Her hands trembled as she read the contents. The message inside wasn't just a thank you, it was an invitation. A ceremony was to be held in Washington, D.C., honoring unsung veterans who had carried their stories quietly for decades. And they wanted Earl to be one of the keynote honorees. Ella couldn't contain her smile as she raced over to his house, letter in hand. He was out front, tending to the small rose bush he always said reminded him of her grandmother. When she handed him the letter and watched his face as he read it, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in years, something beyond pride, beyond emotion. It was peace. The diner had never felt so quiet. The once crackling energy that had buzzed through its narrow aisles and around its chipped counters was now thickened with the kind of tension that seemed to press in from every wall. Annie sat frozen, Her fork paused mid-air as her eyes stayed fixed on the back of one of the young men who had moments earlier jeered at her grandfather. Her heart thudded like a war drum, and she wasn't sure if it was fear, adrenaline, or something else. Maybe a new awareness that the moment they were living through was about to become something no one would forget. Across the room, Grandpa Walt remained seated in silence, his medals still gleaming quietly on his coat, his face calm but unreadable, like a soldier who had long ago learned to feel everything and show nothing. The group of Navy SEALs, all in civilian attire but with unmistakable military precision in their posture, had finished their silent formation near his booth. They didn't need to say a word. Just being there, just standing with reverent poise behind the elderly man, had already spoken volumes. The young men who had been laughing earlier now looked like children caught in the middle of a sermon they didn't understand, confused and guilty, their arrogance now rapidly crumbling into awkward shame. And then, one of the SEALs stepped forward. He was taller than the rest, with a closely trimmed beard and eyes that seemed too steady to belong to someone his age. Annie later learned his name was Mason Holt. Without a word, he placed something gently on the table in front of Grandpa Walt, a patch, worn but respected, embroidered with the insignia of SEAL Team 7. Grandpa Walt looked up at the patch, then back at the man, and something passed between them. It was unspoken and profound, a silent recognition that transcended ranks, generations, and even war. Mason gave a small nod, and Grandpa Walt returned it with the quiet dignity of a man who didn't need a spotlight to validate his life's work. Annie felt her chest tighten as tears welled up in her eyes. She looked around and saw others move too. Mrs. Everett, the local librarian, had pulled a napkin to her face, and even Tom the cook had stopped flipping burgers to lean out from the kitchen and take it all in, his expression unusually soft. But the moment wasn't just about admiration, it was about awakening. Something fundamental shifted in that diner. The presence of the SEALs had made something visible that had always been invisible to too many people. It wasn't just about medals or uniforms. It was about respect, about recognition, about honoring the weight someone carried even when they no longer wore the badge of duty on their chest every day. The oldest SEAL, a man with graying temples and a scar across his right eyebrow, stepped forward next. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Annie would later learn it was a citation, something signed decades ago by a long-retired general, recognizing Grandpa Walt for his actions during an ambush in northern Vietnam that had saved the lives of 7 fellow soldiers. The citation had been circulated privately among veterans, and this man, Dean Rivers, had held onto a copy for years, waiting for the right moment to return it to its rightful place. He placed it beside the patch and stood back. Grandpa Walt didn't move, but his eyes, sharp and glistening, lingered on the paper, and for a fleeting second, Annie saw the stoic expression falter, not out of pain, but out of the overwhelming surprise of being seen. The SEALs didn't stay long. They had made their statement, and like true soldiers, they didn't linger for applause. One by one, they approached Grandpa Walt, placed a hand on his shoulder, or gave a brief nod, and then, quietly, made their way out. The sound of the door's bell jingling as they left rang with a strange kind of finality. When the last one stepped outside, the diner remained frozen for a moment, caught in the stillness they left behind. Then slowly, conversations resumed, not the same ones as before, but quieter, more respectful. The young men who had started the mockery stood awkwardly near the counter, unsure of how to undo what they had done. Eventually, one of them, the one who had laughed the loudest, shuffled over to Grandpa Walt's booth. Annie's breath caught in her throat. She watched closely, uncertain of what was about to happen. The boy didn't speak at first. He just stood there, face flushed, hands twitching at his sides. Then he managed a quiet apology. It was halting, clumsy, and probably not enough, but it was sincere. Grandpa Walt looked up at him, then down at the patch and citation on the table. He didn't reply with words. Instead, he simply gave a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, not quite, but it was something close. It was acknowledgement that the boy had taken a step in the right direction, that maybe, in time, he would learn. Annie exhaled slowly. She felt her body ease. Her shoulders dropped from the tension they had held all morning. Something inside her had shifted too. Seeing her grandfather honored in this way, not with parades or speeches, but with the quiet solidarity of men who understood his journey, had reframed everything. The diner had changed that day. So had the people inside it. And as Grandpa Walt picked up the citation and gently folded it, placing it in his coat pocket beside the medals that had sparked this whole storm, Annie knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. There was still more to unfold, more that would ripple far beyond the walls of that small-town diner. As the afternoon sun began to dip toward the western hills of Willows Creek, casting long, golden streaks through the diner's large windows, the energy in the room shimmered with a surreal stillness. Everyone was still reeling from the moment that had just unfolded. 20 Navy SEALs standing in reverent silence for a man they called a hero, while the once mocking teens now sat pale and visibly ashamed at their corner booth. The regulars remained mostly speechless, a few whispering under their breath, but most simply watched with wide eyes and stunned expressions as the men in uniform surrounded Harold, shaking his hand one by one, thanking him with a quiet dignity that struck deeper than any grand speech could. Annie stood near the counter, with her hands still pressed over her mouth, tears that had long since escaped now streaking her face freely. She couldn't believe what she had witnessed. All those years she spent listening to her grandfather's stories, helping him polish those dusty medals, wondering whether the world had forgotten him. And now, in a single afternoon, the universe had conspired to answer her unspoken question with a resounding, thunderous no. It hadn't forgotten. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to remember. The SEAL, who had introduced himself as Commander Brooks, turned to the crowd, his voice strong and even, yet laced with emotion. He thanked the diner patrons for their patience, explained that they had been passing through the area after wrapping up a training exercise at a nearby base, and one of their members had spotted Harold through the window. "We'd know that ribbon rack anywhere," he'd said, explaining how Harold's service record had been shared among their ranks during training. The stories of what he endured as a POW weren't just tales in a history book for us. They were lessons in courage. Annie's knees buckled slightly as she absorbed this. Her grandfather's suffering in that distant jungle, the years he spent shackled and starved and beaten, all of it had meaning beyond the confines of their quiet little town. To the men who now stood saluting him, his pain had become a beacon. The teens in the corner finally stood, unsure of what to do with themselves. Their leader, the one who had snatched the medals and waved them around like trinkets, stumbled forward, his face red and twitching. "Sir," he said awkwardly, voice cracking, I didn't know. We didn't know." Harold, still seated but more alert than he had been in days, raised a hand. He wasn't angry. There was no fire in his eyes, only something deeper, something that shimmered with the quiet power of a man who had long since stopped seeking vengeance or validation. He spoke slowly but clearly, his voice steady despite the emotion tugging at its edges. He said that it wasn't their fault they didn't know. That the fault lay in a world that had grown too fast, too loud, too busy to teach its young about the weight of silence, the meaning of sacrifice, the history buried beneath medals. One of the SEALs stepped forward and offered the teens a firm but respectful nod. "Learning starts with humility," he said, "and that's what you've shown today." The moment broke with a gentle exhale across the room. The tension began to soften, replaced with murmurs of awe and subtle clapping that began with one elderly gentleman at the back table and slowly rippled outward. Harold turned to Annie, his eyes tired but soft, filled with something she hadn't seen there in a long time: peace. He reached for her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze, one that said everything he couldn't put into words. They sat together as the SEALs gathered around, not to talk war stories or tactics, but to listen. They wanted to hear from him, not just about the pain, but about how he had survived it, about love, family, forgiveness. The conversation lasted hours, the sun slipping into darkness outside while inside, the diner seemed to glow from within. More locals began to arrive as word spread, drawn in not by curiosity, but by respect. It was as though something sacred was happening, a collective reckoning, a communal remembering. The diner's owner brought out pie for everyone, coffee flowed freely, and what started as an ordinary day slowly transformed into something timeless. Near the counter, Annie overheard two teenage girls whispering to each other, one saying how she wished her grandfather was still alive so she could ask him about his time in Korea. Another said she was going to write about Harold for her school project on American heroes. It was a quiet victory, but a powerful one. That night, Harold stayed longer than he had in years. He talked, he laughed softly, and occasionally he drifted off into reflective silence. The medals, now safely pinned back onto his chest by the commander himself, gleamed under the warm diner lights, not just as decorations, but as mirrors to the depth of character they represented. And when the SEALs finally prepared to leave, each one saluted him again. The last man paused, looked Harold in the eyes and said, "You're the reason we serve, sir." Harold nodded gently, the final weight on his chest lifting as if it had never been there. The story wasn't over. It was just beginning a new chapter, one written not in pain or silence, but in remembrance, dignity, and love. Annie knew then that her grandfather's legacy would live on, not just through her, but through everyone who had been in that diner that day and would never forget what they saw, what they learned, and how it made them feel. As the first light of dawn broke over the quiet hills of Fairgrove, golden beams seeped through the diner's wide front windows, casting long, soft shadows across the booths where yesterday's incredible memory still lingered like a sacred echo. The chairs were back in their usual places, the napkin dispensers neatly aligned, the floor freshly mopped. But everything felt different now, as if the walls themselves held a breathless reverence for what had happened, the moment when the quiet dignity of a veteran's service triumphed over ignorance, and the love of a granddaughter pierced through years of silence, carrying his story into the light. Beth stood behind the counter, tracing her fingers over the coffee pot as she watched her grandfather, Henry, sip his morning brew with a calm she hadn't seen in him for years. His eyes were no longer haunted by the shadows of memory or dulled by the weight of being misunderstood. They sparkled now with a quiet pride and gratitude, not for medals or public recognition, but for something far deeper, the understanding that his life's sacrifice had finally been seen, not just through the eyes of strangers in uniform, but through the love of the girl who refused to let his story be buried. The diner had not just been a place of reckoning, it had become the birthplace of a new chapter in both their lives. Customers who once came for pancakes and hot coffee now came for something more. They came to say thank you. They came to look Henry in the eye and offer a handshake, a nod, a hug. And each time they did, Beth would see the walls inside her grandfather soften, the armor he'd built over years slowly falling away, brick by brick. Word had spread beyond the town, too. A local journalist had picked up the story after one of the Navy SEALs posted a brief reflection on social media, recounting the moment the medals clinked as they were returned, the tension in the room, the way the silence had been replaced by the thundering of boots and respect. The post had gone viral, drawing thousands of comments, messages of thanks, and calls from old friends Henry hadn't heard from in decades. Veterans from across the country began sharing their own stories, some filled with triumph, others still aching with silence. The town became a beacon for something bigger than itself. What began with cruelty in a diner ended with a national ripple of healing, of acknowledgement, of pride. Beth and Henry began receiving invitations to veteran centers, to schools, to military ceremonies, not as public figures, but as witnesses. They didn't go to tell others how to feel or what to believe. They went to listen, to offer a quiet space where others could speak what had been locked away for years. Henry, who had once walked with a limp of both body and spirit, now stood taller. His voice, once gravelly from age and pain, rang clearer. When he spoke to young recruits or families of soldiers who never came home, his words came not from a script, but from the deep well of lived experience and hard-won understanding. Beth never left his side. Their bond, once built through shared silence and tentative gestures, was now unshakable. She had not only preserved his legacy, she had become a bridge between generations, showing that love backed with courage could turn even the cruelest moments into something powerful, something lasting. One day, months after the incident, the town held a special ceremony. Not a parade, not a political statement, just a simple gathering in the park where a new memorial had been installed. A bronze plaque, etched with names, including Henry's, surrounded by a circle of flowering dogwoods and a single stone bench. The plaque didn't list battles or decorations. It simply read, "To those who served quietly, we see you now." As Henry sat there beside Beth, a breeze stirred the trees and carried with it the sound of a bugle playing taps in the distance. No grand speeches were given. No television cameras came. But in that stillness, surrounded by neighbors, veterans, and young families, something sacred passed between them all. The understanding that silence is not the same as invisibility, and that honor can be reclaimed, even decades later, with one brave voice. Later that evening, back at the diner, Beth placed a new frame on the wall. Inside it was a photograph taken the day the SEALs had walked in. 20 men in uniform, lined up behind Henry, saluting a man they had never met but instinctively knew deserved their respect. The photo was more than a keepsake. It was a reminder that the smallest acts, a salute, a granddaughter's defiance, a cup of spilled coffee, can shift the course of a life, and sometimes the soul of a town. And so life in Fairgrove moved on, not with fanfare, but with deeper roots. Customers lingered a little longer, asked more questions, and listened more closely. Children pointed at the photo on the wall and asked who the man was, and Beth would tell them. She'd speak of courage not as something found in battlefields alone, but in diners, in hospital beds, in letters never sent. She'd speak of her grandfather, not as a hero in the abstract, but as the man who showed her that legacy is not what the world writes about you, but what you choose to pass on. And Henry? He still wore his flannel, still ordered his eggs over easy, still chuckled at the corny jokes the line cooks told. But his medals now hung not in a dusty drawer, but on a small wall in the diner beside the photo, not for bragging, but for remembering, for honoring, for showing every person who walked through the door that silence can be broken and dignity reclaimed, not through revenge, but through truth, respect, and the love that dares to speak even when no one is listening. And in that quiet corner of the world, the clink of those medals remained, not as an echo of the past, but as a living note of grace. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.